She had ironed their gowns, pinned their hair, and carried their gloves across 3 flights of stairs. And still, when the music started, not a single soul in that ballroom looked her way. Clara Whitcomb was 23 years old, and she had already learned what it meant to be invisible in her own father's world. But that summer evening in Charleston, one man looked, and everything Augusta Whitcomb had spent 6 years building began to crack. If this story moves you, subscribe, stay until the end, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far Clara's story travels. The summer of 1816 arrived in Charleston like a debt that could no longer be ignored, hot, suffocating, and dressed in its finest clothes. The Hargrove Assembly Hall was lit from floor to ceiling with oil lamps and candles, and every family worth knowing in South Carolina had sent their daughters in silk and their sons in polished boots. The music from the string quartet floated through the wide-open windows out over the harbor and dissolved into the warm, salt air. The Whitcomb women had arrived at 7:30, all 4 of them, though only 3 of them were expected to be seen. Clara Whitcomb stood near the east corridor that separated the main ballroom from the servants' passage. She wore a blue dress, not new, not fashionable, but clean and pressed, because she had pressed it herself that morning while Caroline and Eliza slept. In her left hand, she held a pair of ivory gloves that belonged to Eliza. In her right, she held a silk fan that belonged to Caroline. She was not a guest. She was not a servant. She existed somewhere in the terrible space between close enough to be used and visible enough to be forgotten. Augusta Whitcomb moved through the room like a woman who had rehearsed every step. She was handsome in the way that sharpened with aged cheekbones that cut eyes that calculated. She wore black trimmed with burgundy lace, a widow's elegance turned into a weapon, and she steered Caroline and Eliza toward the center of the room with the practiced ease of a woman who knew exactly what her daughters were worth on the open market of Charleston society. "Smile," Augusta said low and precise without turning her head. "And stand straighter, Eliza. You look like you're waiting for a verdict." "I'm warm," Eliza said. "Everyone is warm. No one who matters shows it." Caroline laughed just softly enough to be charming. She was the prettier one. Golden-haired, soft-voiced, practiced in the art of appearing effortless. Eliza was sharper, her humor quicker and crueler, and she had learned that a cutting remark delivered with a smile could clear a room of rivals faster than beauty alone. Neither of them looked back at Clara. Clara didn't expect them to. She shifted the fan to her other hand and watched the room. She had been to these assemblies before enough times to know the rhythms, who bowed to whom, which families were rising, which were quietly drowning behind silk and smiles. Her father had brought her to this hall when she was 9 years old. He had lifted her onto his shoulders near the back balcony so she could see the chandeliers above the crowd. "One day you'll dance here, Clara girl," he had said, "and every man in the room will wish he'd asked you first." Thomas Whitcomb had been a generous dreamer. He had also been dead for 6 years, and the estate he left behind. The shipping shares the property along the Cooper River. The house on Meeting Street had passed through hands she never fully understood into a life she had not chosen. Clara. She turned. A woman in gray came toward her from the edge of the room, small, deliberate, dressed simply in a way that was its own kind of elegance. Mrs. Ruth Bellamy was 61 years old, a lawyer's widow, and one of the few people in Charleston who had known Thomas Whitcomb before his money changed him and after it ran out. "Mrs. Bellamy," Clara's voice was quiet. "I didn't know you would be here tonight." "I almost wasn't." Mrs. Bellamy stopped beside her and turned to look at the room with the expression of someone examining a painting she did not admire. "I came because I needed to speak with you somewhere. Augusta couldn't arrange the walls." Clara went still. "That's a strange thing to say. I'm a strange woman. It served me." Mrs. Bellamy didn't look at her directly yet. She kept her voice low and even, the way a person speaks when they are choosing each word like a step on uncertain ground. "Your father's shipping shares, Clara. The ones that were meant to transfer to you on your 21st birthday." "They were settled," Clara said carefully. "Augusta told me they were settled in the estate proceedings. Augusta told you a great many things." Now Mrs. Bellamy turned. Her eyes were gray and steady and held nothing back. My late husband handled your father's papers before he died. I found correspondence last month, letters between your father's solicitor and a third party. Clara, those shares were never legally transferred. The paperwork was altered. The music swelled somewhere behind her. Clara heard it like it was coming from a different country. Altered, she repeated. The signature on the transfer document is not your father's hand. I've seen enough of his correspondence to know the difference. Mrs. Bellamy pressed her lips together. I don't have the full proof yet, but I have enough to begin asking questions that Augusta will not like. Clara felt the weight of the ivory gloves in her hand. She felt the weight of 6 years in a house that had been her father's, living at the edge of a family that had never claimed her. Why are you telling me now? She asked. Here. Because I leave for Richmond in the morning and I didn't trust a letter. Mrs. Bellamy reached into her small bag and pressed a folded card into Clara's free hand. That is my solicitor's address in Richmond. When I return 3 weeks, perhaps 4, I will come to you with what I have. But you should know, Clara. You should know what may have been taken from you. Clara, the voice came from across the room, bright and carrying, designed to travel. Eliza. Clara closed her fingers around the card and slipped it into the side of her dress before she turned. Eliza was standing near the center of the floor, arm raised, beckoning with 2 fingers, the way a person calls a dog. Clara, come here, now. Mrs. Bellamy said nothing. Clara handed her Mrs. Bellamy's arm briefly, a small private thing, and walked across the ballroom. The crowd parted, the way crowds always parted, for someone who walked with purpose, and Clara had learned years ago that the only power she had in rooms like this was to move as if she belonged. Head up, steps even, face calm. She was nearly to Eliza when she realized that half a dozen people were watching. You have my fan, Eliza said. Not a question, an accusation. Caroline's fan, Clara said. Yours is still in your bag. Then give Caroline her fan and get mine. Eliza held out her hand. My wrist is aching. You've been here 20 minutes. Clara. The name came out flat and final, a door closing. Clara opened her hand and held out the fan. Eliza snatched it without looking at her. And my gloves, Eliza said. Give them here. You've probably wrinkled them carrying them around. They're not wrinkled. Eliza, honestly? Caroline said, her voice carrying the particular exhaustion of someone who preferred cruelty to be quieter. You're making a scene. I'm asking for my property, Eliza said. That's not a scene. Clara set the gloves across Eliza's palm. And then, because Eliza was watching the room instead of her hands, because the ivory caught the light and slipped, because 6 years of being treated like furniture had made Clara's hands just slightly less careful than they used to be, one glove slid off Eliza's palm and fell. Time moved the way it always moves in a room full of people who are waiting for something to happen slower than it should. The glove spun once in the air. A hand reached out and caught it before it touched the floor. The hand belonged to a man who was standing 3 feet away, which was close enough that he must have already been watching, though Clara could not have said when he had moved near or why. He was tall, not ostentatiously so, but the kind of tall that a room recalibrates around without knowing it. He wore plain dark clothes, no ornament, no peacock display. His face was the kind that said more by what it withheld than what it showed. Clara knew the name before she could place the face. Everyone in Charleston knew the name. Nathaniel Blackwood, widower, river landowner, a man whose family had held more acres along the Cooper River than most men held opinions, and whose silence in public gatherings was noted with the anxious respect people reserved for things they could not entirely predict. He had not been at an assembly in years. People had murmured about it when he walked in. He stood now with Eliza's glove in his hand, and he looked not at Eliza. He looked at Clara. Eliza recovered first. She always did. Mr. Blackwood. Her voice came out warm and bright, a door thrown open to morning light. How kind. You may return that to me. May I? He didn't frame it as a question. He looked at the glove in his hand, then back at Clara. Something moved in his expression, assessment recognition, something Clara couldn't name. "Miss Whitcomb." Eliza's breath shortened just slightly. She thought he meant her. Eliza Whitcomb of the Whitcomb girls, the fashionable ones, the ones everyone knew. But his eyes hadn't moved from Clara. "I believe this belongs," he said, and his voice was low and deliberate. The voice of a man who chose his words the way a careful person chooses their footing to the only honest woman in the room. The silence lasted exactly 1 beat too long to be accidental. Eliza went rigid. Caroline's smile froze at its edges. Augusta, who had materialized somewhere to the left without Clara noticing, went absolutely still. Clara looked at him. She did not look away. "That's a bold claim to make," she said, "about a woman you haven't spoken to before tonight." "Bold," he agreed, "and accurate." He held out the glove, not to Eliza, not dropped onto a table, but offered to Clara as if she were the one it belonged to. "Miss Whitcomb, would you do me the honor of the next dance?" Eliza made a sound that wasn't quite words. Augusta's hand found Caroline's arm and gripped it. Clara looked at the glove. She looked at Nathaniel Blackwood. She was aware of the ring of attention around them, the half-turned shoulders, the stilled fans, the conversations that had gone quiet in a radius that was still expanding. She had spent 6 years being invisible in rooms like this one. She took the glove. "I would," she said. "To talk." The floor cleared the way floors clear for men like Nathaniel Blackwood. Not because anyone ordered it, but because the room understood something without being told. Clara kept her spine straight and her chin level and tried not to think about the fact that her hands were not entirely steady. He danced well, not with the showy precision of a man who had practiced to impress, but with the natural ease of a man who had learned to do things properly and then stopped thinking about them. He held her at the correct distance. His hand at her back was firm and perfectly appropriate. "You're wondering why," he said without preamble. "I'm wondering several things," Clara said. "Pick one." She looked at him. "Why the glove? You could have handed it to her." "I could have, but you didn't." "No." "That's not an answer." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." He turned them through the pattern of the dance, and his voice stayed even and quiet-pitched for her alone. "You've been carrying their things all evening. I watched you come in." "I come in with the family." "You came in behind the family. There's a difference." Clara felt something tighten in her chest. Not pain exactly. The particular pressure of being seen when you have been invisible for so long that being looked at has its own discomfort. "It would be better," she said, keeping her voice level, "if you didn't make observations about my domestic arrangements in the middle of a ballroom." "It would be easier," he said. "I'm not always concerned with easier, Mr. Blackwood." She met his eyes directly. "I don't know what you think you observed or why you've chosen tonight to observe it, but I'm not a charitable cause." He looked at her with an expression she couldn't entirely read. "I didn't say you were," he said. "You're treating me like one. I asked you to dance. You did it in front of everyone in this room who knows my family." Clara kept her voice quiet and steady, even though something in her wanted to be neither. "You handed me that glove in front of Eliza Whitcomb and called me the most honest woman present, which is Mr. Blackwood. That's not a compliment. That's a declaration. And I haven't decided yet what it's in service of." He was quiet for 2 full measures of music. Then, almost imperceptibly, something in his expression shifted, softened, was not quite the right word, but released perhaps like a door that had been held for a long time, finally allowed to rest. "You're more careful than most people give you credit for," he said. "Most people don't give me much credit for anything. I've noticed. You've been in this room less than an hour. Some things take less than an hour to notice if you're paying attention." He guided them through a turn, smooth and unhurried. "I knew your father, Miss Whitcomb. Not well. We crossed paths twice in business. He spoke of you." Clara went still inside, even as her body continued through the steps. "What did he say?" He said his daughter had his stubbornness and her mother's judgment. A pause. He meant it as the highest compliment he knew. The music moved on. Clara moved with it. She was aware of Augusta watching from the edge of the room. She could feel it, the way you feel cold coming through a window before you see that it's open. "My father has been dead 6 years," she said. "I know." "Then why?" She stopped. Started again. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because," Nathaniel Blackwood said, "I think someone should have told you a long time ago that Thomas Whitcom was proud of you, and that the people who decided you were worth nothing after he died were wrong." The dance ended. He stepped back, bowed formally correctly, the bow you give a woman you intend to be taken seriously, not the small concession of an obligation, a bow with weight to it. Clara curtsied because her body knew how even when her mind was somewhere else entirely. Around them, the room exhaled. Eliza Whitcomb's face was the color of new plaster. Caroline was speaking to Augusta in whispers. Augusta herself was looking at Nathaniel Blackwood with an expression that had moved several steps past surprise and arrived somewhere much colder. Mrs. Bellamy, still near the east corridor, caught Clara's eye across the room. She said nothing. She only nodded once and looked at Nathaniel Blackwood the way a woman looks at something she has been expecting for longer than she expected to wait. Clara accepted a glass of water from a passing server and moved to the edge of the floor. She pressed the folded card from Mrs. Bellamy flat against her palm, feeling the crease of it. The shipping shares were never legally transferred. Her father's voice came back to her unbidden and unhelpful, the way the dead tend to speak at the worst moments. "One day you'll dance here, Clara girl." She had danced. She did not know yet what it cost. But she knew Augusta Whitcom's stillness well enough, the way a held breath sounds different from a resting one, to understand that tonight had changed something. What exactly she could not yet say. But she had spent 6 years learning to read the weather in this family before the storm arrived. The storm was coming. She pressed the card deeper into the fold of her dress and looked across the ballroom one more time. Nathaniel Blackwood was speaking to a man near the far window. He didn't look back at her, but he had positioned himself, she noticed, exactly where he could see the entire room, including the east corridor, including her. Clara set down the water glass, straightened her spine, and decided that whatever came next, she would not face it with someone else's gloves in her hands. She was done carrying things for people who didn't know her name. Clara did not sleep. She lay in the narrow bed, in the room at the back of the house, the room that had been a sewing room before Augusta decided Clara needed less space and the household needed more storage, and she stared at the ceiling and listened to the house settle around her. Downstairs, Augusta had spoken for nearly 2 hours after they returned from the assembly. Clara had heard it all through the floorboards. The sharp percussion of Augusta's heels. Caroline's murmured agreements. Eliza's voice once raised above the others, saying something that ended with Clara's name like a verdict. She pressed Mrs. Bellamy's card flat against the bedside table and read the Richmond address in the dark by the light of the window until she had it memorized. Then she folded it again and put it inside the lining of her winter coat at the back of the wardrobe, the last place Augusta's hands ever went, because Augusta did not believe Clara owned anything worth finding. She thought about what Nathaniel Blackwood had said. He said his daughter had his stubbornness and her mother's judgment. Her father had told a near stranger more about what he thought of her than he had ever managed to say out loud in the years he was alive to say it. That was Thomas Whitcom, entirely a man of grand private feelings and inadequate public words, and it should not have hurt after 6 years. But grief, Clara had learned, did not follow a reasonable schedule. She was still awake when the sun came up. She was dressed and in the kitchen when Maddie the housekeeper came in at 6:30. "You look like you fought something in your sleep," Maddie said without ceremony. "I didn't sleep." "That explains it." Maddie set a pot on the stove and looked at her sideways. "Half the street's already talking about last night, you know. Mrs. Hargrove's girl came by first thing to return a shawl her mother borrowed, which nobody asked her to do before 9 in the morning. She stayed 20 minutes. What are they saying? That Nathaniel Blackwood danced with you." Maddie said it plainly, the way she said everything, like facts were facts, and fussing over them wasted good energy. And that he called you the most honest woman in the room in front of Augusta and both her girls. He said something like that. Something like that, or exactly that. Clara wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. Exactly that. Maddie was quiet for a moment. He's a serious man, she said finally. Not the kind who says things he doesn't mean. I don't know what he means. No, Maddie agreed. But Augusta does. That's why she talked for 2 hours last night. She turned back to the stove. Whatever's coming, girl, you'd best be standing when it gets here. Whatever was coming arrived at 10 o'clock in the morning. Clara heard the knock from upstairs where she was repairing a hem on one of Eliza's riding skirts. Not because she was asked, but because it had been sitting on the sewing table for a week, and the alternative was listening to Eliza complain about it again. She heard Maddie's footsteps. She heard the front door. She heard a voice low and unhurried that she recognized before she could have said why. She set down the skirt. Augusta's voice came from the parlor, bright and carrying in the particular way she deployed when she was performing for an audience she considered important. Mr. Blackwood, what a remarkable surprise. We were not expecting you, but of course please sit. Please, Caroline, come in here. Eliza, where are you? Clara walked to the top of the stairs. She did not go down. Not yet. She could hear the parlor from there, not every word but the shape of the conversation. Augusta's warmth, which was a weapon in a velvet case. Caroline's practiced laugh. Eliza arriving a little breathless, the sound of skirts arranged quickly. And beneath it all, Nathaniel Blackwood's voice saying very little in the way of a man who has already decided something and is simply waiting for the room to stop rearranging itself around him. Then Augusta said, I'll have Clara bring the tea. And a beat later, one single beat, Nathaniel said, Actually, Mrs. Whitcomb, I'd like to speak with Miss Whitcomb. Silence. Not the comfortable kind. Caroline is right here, Augusta said with a lightness that cost her something. And Eliza, of course, we were just saying last night how... Clara Whitcomb, Nathaniel said. Thomas's daughter. The silence this time was a different animal. Clara descended the stairs. She had not primped. She was wearing the same gray dress she worked in, with her hair pulled back simply, and her hands were slightly red from the needle because she had been gripping it too tightly when she heard his voice. She walked into the parlor and did not look at Augusta or Caroline or Eliza. She looked at Nathaniel Blackwood, who was standing near the fireplace with his hat in his hands and his expression precisely level. Mr. Blackwood, she said. Miss Whitcomb. He glanced once at the room, at Augusta's frozen smile, at Eliza's color, at Caroline's careful blankness. I wonder if we might speak privately. This is my household, Augusta said, and the warmth was gone now, replaced with the thing beneath it. Anything said to Clara can be said in front of the family. Nathaniel looked at her for a moment. All right, he said, if that's your preference. He reached into his coat and produced a folded document. He held it out, not to Augusta, not to Clara, but set it on the side table in a way that made it available to anyone who wanted to reach for it. 6 years ago, he said, a debt was recorded between your late husband's shipping venture and the Blackwood estate. The venture collapsed. The debt was never settled, with interest and penalties over 6 years. He paused not for effect, but the way a careful man pauses before a number he knows will land hard. It comes to $4,200. Every sound in the room stopped. Augusta's hand went to her throat. That's... Caroline started. Impossible, Eliza said. It's documented, Nathaniel said, calm as a river in November. I have the original agreements, the correspondence, and the signatures. I did not come here today to collect that debt, Mrs. Whitcomb. I came here to propose an alternative arrangement. Augusta found her footing again the way she always did, not gracefully but effectively. What kind of arrangement? Marriage, Nathaniel said. To Clara. Eliza stood up. She actually stood up from her chair, which Clara noted distantly was perhaps the most honest thing she had ever seen her stepsister do. You cannot be serious, Eliza said. Eliza! Augusta's voice cut across the room like a blade, and Eliza sat back down, though her hands were shaking. Augusta turned to Nathaniel. She was composing herself in real time. Clara could see it happening, the rapid calculation behind the eyes, the way Augusta always looked when she was deciding which version of herself was most useful. "Mr. Blackwood, surely you understand that Clara she has not had the preparation, the education, "I'm not asking for your assessment of her preparation," Nathaniel said. "I'm asking for your agreement, in exchange for which the debt is forgiven in full, and I will make no further claim on this household." "And if I refuse," Augusta said, "then I file the claim with the Charleston courts by the end of the week." The room was a held breath. Clara looked at the document on the side table. She looked at Nathaniel. She looked at Augusta's face, which was for perhaps the first time in 6 years something close to afraid. "May I see the document?" Clara said. Every head turned. "Clara," Augusta said in the voice she used when she wanted compliance wrapped in the appearance of gentleness, "this is not your concern." "It's my marriage you're discussing," Clara said. "It's very much my concern." She crossed the room and picked up the document before anyone could object. She read it, all of it. She was aware of the silence behind her, of Eliza's shallow breathing, and Caroline's absolute stillness, and Augusta recalculating every 3 seconds. She read the debt agreement, the signature lines, the figures, the interest schedule. She was also reading what was between the lines. The debt was real. She could see that. The original agreement existed. But $4,000 in interest over 6 years on a venture, the size of her father's, seemed. She folded the document. She looked at Nathaniel Blackwood. There was something in his expression when she looked up. Not guilt exactly, but awareness. The look of a man who knows he is being read and is deciding how much to reveal. "You're more careful than most people give you credit for," he had said last night. She thought so are you. "Yes," she said. Augusta made a sound. "Clara," Caroline started. "I said yes." Clara set the document back on the table. She kept her voice even and her eyes on Nathaniel. "I'll marry you, Mr. Blackwood, on one condition." He waited. "I want access to every document related to my father's estate, the original shipping agreements, the correspondence, everything that was handled after his death." She paused. "That is my condition." Augusta rose from her chair. "You have no right to make conditions. You have no legal standing in this household. You have no—" "She'll have legal standing as my wife," Nathaniel said quietly. "As of this morning, if she agrees." "This morning," Augusta repeated. "There's a magistrate in town who owes me a professional courtesy." He looked at Clara. "If that's what you want." It wasn't what Clara had imagined for herself in the years she had let herself imagine anything. A morning in a gray dress with her hands red from a needle and her stepsister's skirt half finished upstairs. No flowers, no guests, no father standing beside her. But the document on the table was real, and the debt was real, and so was Augusta's fear, and so was Mrs. Bellamy's card pressed into the lining of a winter coat. And there was something about the way Nathaniel Blackwood was standing, not triumphant, not performing, but still like a man who had decided and was now simply waiting for the world to catch up, that made Clara think this was not quite the simple transaction it appeared to be. She didn't trust him. She didn't distrust him entirely either. And in 6 years, that was more than she had felt about anyone in this house. "All right," she said. "This morning." They were married before noon. The magistrate was a thin man named Aldridge, who performed the ceremony in his office with the efficiency of someone who handled matters of record rather than matters of feeling. 2 clerks served as witnesses. The whole thing took 11 minutes. Clara signed her name on 4 separate documents and received a 5th in return, her marriage certificate, which she folded and put inside her dress in the same interior pocket where Mrs. Bellamy's card had been. Nathaniel said nothing to her until they were outside. Then he said, "I've sent a man ahead to Blackwood Landing to prepare a room for you. We'll leave this afternoon." "I need to collect my things from the house." "I assumed." I've arranged a wagon." She stopped walking. "You've been very thorough," she said. "I try to be, Mr. Blackwood." She turned to face him directly. The sun was high and the street was busy, and she felt completely unmoored from every recognizable thing in her life. "I want to be honest with you." "I'd appreciate that. I didn't marry you because of the debt," she said. "I married you because my father's estate was handled by people who had every reason to misrepresent it, and you're the only leverage I've found in 6 years that might give me access to the truth." She held his gaze. "I want you to know that. So we're not pretending." Something moved across his face, surprise maybe, and then something else, something warmer and more careful. "All right," he said. "Is that all you have to say? For now." He looked at her for a moment longer. "I'd like to be honest with you too, Miss Whitcomb." "Mrs. Blackwood," she corrected, and the sound of it was strange in her own mouth. "Mrs. Blackwood." He said it like he was trying it out. "I was also thorough for reasons that aren't entirely straightforward. We can discuss those when we're somewhere with fewer people listening." Clara looked at the street around them. 2 women she recognized from the assembly last night were standing half a block away, doing absolutely nothing with great concentration. "Tonight, then," she said. "Tonight?" He agreed. The wagon arrived at the Meeting Street house at 2 o'clock. Clara went upstairs and packed what was hers, which took less time than it should have because most of what she owned fit into one trunk and a smaller bag. Her books, her mother's Bible, 2 dresses that were actually hers and not hand-downs, the winter coat with the card in the lining. Eliza appeared in the doorway while she was latching the trunk. "You think this is a victory?" Eliza said. Clara didn't stop what she was doing. "I think I'm packing a trunk." "He's going to tire of you in a month." Eliza's voice was sharp as glass. "He's doing this for some business reason, some land reason, some reason that has nothing to do with you. You know that." "Yes," Clara said. "I do know that." "Then why?" "Because his reasons and mine don't have to be the same to both be useful." She closed the latch. She looked at Eliza directly. "I'm not leaving because I think Nathaniel Blackwood is in love with me. I'm leaving because staying here stopped being a choice a long time ago." Eliza said nothing. Clara picked up the smaller bag. "Tell your mother," she said, "that I hope she sleeps better without me in the house." She carried the trunk down herself. Nathaniel's man tried to take it from her on the stairs, and she shook her head once, and he stepped back. Augusta was in the parlor doorway when Clara reached the bottom. She stood with both hands crossed in front of her, and her face arranged in an expression Clara had never quite seen on her before. Not anger, not performance, but something rawer. Something that might, in a different woman, have been called grief. "You think you've won something," Augusta said. Clara set the trunk down. "I think I've left," she said. "That's enough for today." "He'll use you," Augusta said. "Same as everyone uses a woman without money. Same as your father used your mother and left her with nothing. Same as—" "My father loved my mother," Clara said, and her voice came out steadier than she expected. "He was imperfect, and he made mistakes, and he left things undone that should have been done. But he loved her. I know the difference, Mrs. Whitcomb. You taught it to me yourself by showing me what love looks like when it isn't there." Augusta's face did something complicated and unresolved. Clara picked up the trunk. She walked out the front door and did not look back. The road to Blackwood Landing took 3 hours by wagon following the river south out of Charleston, through land that opened gradually into long stretches of farmland and timber, and the particular kind of quiet that comes when a city stops and something older begins. Clara sat in the back of the wagon with her trunk and watched the river through the trees. Nathaniel rode alongside on a dark horse. He didn't try to make conversation. She appreciated that. It was near 5 o'clock when the estate appeared. A large house, set back from the river, white-painted wood with wide porches, surrounded by outbuildings and fields that stretched further than she could see. It was not ostentatious. It had the look of a place that had been built for use rather than display, and that had been maintained with varying degrees of attention over several generations. There were people outside when they arrived. Workers, household staff, a cluster of men near the stables who stopped what they were doing and looked. Clara noticed as she climbed down from the wagon that several of them exchanged glances that held questions they were not asking out loud. A woman in her 50s came down the porch steps, broad-shouldered, direct with a set of keys at her belt that announced her function before she spoke a word. "Mrs. Holt," Nathaniel said as he dismounted. "This is Mrs. Blackwood. She'll need the East Room prepared." Mrs. Holt looked at Clara. The look was not unfriendly, but it was thorough, the look of a woman who ran a complicated household and was rapidly assessing what this new variable meant for every system she had in place. "Mrs. Blackwood," she said. "Mrs. Holt." Clara met the look directly. "I'd like to see the house if that's possible. The whole house, and the ledgers when you have time to show me." Mrs. Holt's eyebrows rose a fraction. She looked at Nathaniel. He said nothing. "The ledgers," Mrs. Holt repeated. "Household accounts," Clara said. "Supply orders, staff wages, maintenance costs. I'd like to understand how the estate operates before I make any decisions." She paused. "I assume there are decisions to be made." Mrs. Holt was quiet for a moment, that stretched into two. Then she said, "There are always decisions to be made, ma'am." Something in her expression shifted just slightly, just enough. "I'll have them ready after supper." Nathaniel looked at Clara as Mrs. Holt went back up the steps. He looked at her the way he had looked at her in the parlor that morning, with that quality of recalculation of adjusting something he had already planned to accommodate, something he hadn't anticipated. "You didn't waste any time," he said. "I told you I wasn't here to be decorative." "So you did." He handed the horse's reins to a waiting stable hand and walked toward the house. He paused at the foot of the steps and turned back. "Supper is at 7. We'll talk after." "You said you'd be honest with me." "I said tonight." He looked at her steadily. "I keep my word, Mrs. Blackwood." "We'll find out," she said. She followed him inside. The entry hall was wide and cool, and on the side table near the staircase, she noticed it immediately. A ledger left carelessly, pages open to a column of figures that didn't add up on first glance. She stopped. She looked at the numbers. Supplies ordered in quantities that didn't match the size of the staff. Wages logged in a format that made the individual entries harder to cross-reference. Small things. The kind of small things that accumulated quietly over years while everyone was looking somewhere else. She closed the ledger gently and set it back exactly as she found it. She looked up. Mrs. Holt was watching her from the top of the stairs. Neither of them spoke. But something was communicated, a kind of recognition. One practical woman to another, that things in this house were not as orderly as they appeared, and that someone had finally arrived who was going to pay attention. Clara put her hand on the banister. "Which way is the East Room?" she asked. "I'll show you, ma'am," Mrs. Holt said. The supper was quiet. The food was adequate. Nathaniel sat at the head of a table clearly built for more people than were using it, and Clara sat to his right, and they ate in a silence that was not uncomfortable, exactly more like two people who have agreed to a negotiation and are waiting for the appropriate moment to begin. After the plates were cleared, after Mrs. Holt disappeared into the kitchen, Nathaniel set down his glass and said, "Ask. How much of that debt was real?" Clara said. The silence lasted 4 full seconds. "Most of it," he said. "Most of it," she repeated. "Not all of it." His jaw tightened just fractionally. "No, not all of it." Clara set her hands flat on the table. "How much did you exaggerate?" "Enough to make refusal impractical." "That is not a number." "No." He looked at her. "It isn't." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "And she heard it cost him something, a small and specific something, a third approximately." Clara breathed in slowly. She breathed out. She thought about the wagon ride and the packed trunk and the morning in a magistrate's office with her name on 4 documents. She thought about what it meant to have made a choice based on partial information without knowing it was partial. "Why?" she said. "Tell me why." Because Augusta Whitcomb was going to marry you off to a man named Hargreaves by the end of the summer, Nathaniel said. He's 63 years old, and he owes money to men who collect debts in ways that go beyond paperwork. He met her eyes without looking away. I knew your father. I knew what was done to his estate after he died. And I knew that if I walked into that house and made a reasonable offer for a fair arrangement, Augusta would refuse it because she needed you where you were. Useful, invisible, blocked from asking questions. Clara stared at him. You manipulated me, she said. I removed you from a situation that was going to harm you. That is not a different thing. Her voice came out sharp and she let it. You made a decision about my life without my consent based on information you had, and I didn't, and you dressed it in paperwork and called it an arrangement. You moved me, Mr. Blackwood, the same way Augusta moved me, from one room to another, from one ledger to another. Nathaniel said nothing. The silence was not comfortable this time. I did not save you, she said, and her voice had dropped, which was somehow worse than raised. If all you did was move me. He looked at her for a long moment. No, he said finally. You're right. She hadn't expected him to say it that plainly. That doesn't fix it, she said. I know. He didn't look away. But it's true. The candles burned between them. Outside, the river made its constant sound. Somewhere in the estate a door closed, and footsteps crossed a floor above them, and the house went on being a house with all its locked rooms and unbalanced ledgers and questions she had not yet finished asking. Clara looked at her hands on the table. She thought about what she had and what she didn't. She had a marriage certificate in her dress. She had access now to documents she had never been able to reach from the back room in Augusta's house. She had a name temporarily that carried weight in this county. She had time if she was careful with it. What she didn't have was a single clear answer about any of it. I want every document related to my father's estate, she said. Every ledger in this house, every correspondence, every transaction from the time he died to now. And I want to understand the full picture of what actually happened. I'll give you everything I have, he said. Is that a promise? Yes. You broke one agreement already tonight, she said. The debt figure. That wasn't an agreement, he said. That was a deception I'm now correcting. He held her gaze. This is a promise. There's a difference. Clara stood. She pushed her chair back and stood, and Nathaniel Blackwood did not move, did not scramble to stand or reach for her or perform any of the gestures of a man managing a situation. He sat and watched her the way he watched everything steady and waiting and more aware than he showed. Good night, Mr. Blackwood, she said. Good night, Mrs. Blackwood. She walked out of the dining room and up the stairs to the east room, which Mrs. Holt had made up with clean sheets and a small lamp and a jar of summer flowers on the windowsill, a small practical kindness from a practical woman. Clara sat on the edge of the bed. She pressed her palms together and breathed. She had been married for 11 hours. She had left the only home she'd had for 6 years. She had discovered that the man she married had lied to bring her here. She had also discovered that he had done it to protect her from something she hadn't known was coming, and that he had admitted the lie without flinching when she pressed him, and that somewhere in this estate were documents that might finally tell her what had happened to her father's name. None of it was what she had expected. All of it was something she could work with. She lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling of her new room, in her new husband's house, in a marriage built on a manipulated debt and a dance she hadn't asked for, and a glove that had slipped out of the wrong hand at exactly the right moment. She thought, I'm not done yet. She closed her eyes. She slept. She woke before the house did. That had been her habit for 6 years. The particular survival instinct of a woman who learned early that the hours before Augusta rose were the only hours that belonged entirely to her. But this morning, the habit carried her somewhere new. Down an unfamiliar hall, past rooms she hadn't yet opened to the study at the end of the east wing, that Mrs. Holt had pointed to the night before, with a key, and the quiet observation that the household accounts were kept there. Clara lit the lamp on the desk and opened the first ledger. She was still there 2 hours later when she heard Mrs. Holt's footsteps in the hall. "You didn't sleep long," Mrs. Holt said from the doorway. "I slept enough." Clara didn't look up. She had 3 ledgers open on the desk and a 4th on her lap, and she was working through them with the focused stillness of someone assembling a puzzle that someone else had deliberately scattered. "Mrs. Holt, these supply orders from last spring, the timber and the river grain. Who approved them?" Mrs. Holt came into the room. She looked at the ledgers on the desk the way a person looks at a thing they've been waiting for someone else to notice. "Mr. Pollard approved them," she said. "He managed the estate accounts until February." "Where is Mr. Pollard now?" "Gone." A pause. "Mr. Blackwood let him go in March. Didn't say why, at least not to me." Clara set her finger on a column of figures. "These timber orders are billed at a rate 20% above what a Cooper River supplier would charge. And the quantities," she moved her finger down, "are logged at amounts that don't match the maintenance work actually done on the property. I walked the south outbuilding yesterday afternoon. The roof hasn't been touched in at least 2 years, but there are 3 separate billing entries for roofing supplies." Mrs. Holt was quiet. "Someone was taking money," Clara said. Not a question. "Someone was taking money." Mrs. Holt agreed with the flat exhaustion of a woman who had suspected something for a long time and never had the standing to say it out loud. "For how long? 3 years at my guess, maybe 4. Clara looked at her. "You knew." "I suspected." Mrs. Holt straightened. "I'm a housekeeper, Mrs. Blackwood. I run this house. I don't run the accounts. I didn't have the authority or the access to prove anything, and without proof." She stopped. Then, "Mr. Blackwood is not an easy man to bring bad news to." "I'll handle Mr. Blackwood," Clara said. "Can you get me the staff wage records from the last 4 years? They're in the cabinet behind you." "Then pull them." Clara turned back to the ledger. "Please." Mrs. Holt pulled them. They worked side by side for the better part of an hour. Clara reading, Mrs. Holt confirming or correcting from memory, a quiet and efficient collaboration between 2 practical women in a room full of answers that had been waiting for the right questions. By the time Nathaniel knocked on the open study door at 8:30, Clara had filled 4 pages of notes in her own hand and found 6 separate instances of billing fraud across 2 separate accounts. She didn't look up when he came in. "You've been here since before sunrise," he said. "Your estate has been robbed for 4 years," she said. "Someone should have noticed sooner." She heard him step into the room. She heard the pause when he saw the open ledgers, the notes, Mrs. Holt standing quietly to the side with the wage records in her arms. "Pollard," he said. "Pollard," she confirmed. "Though I'd want to know if anyone else had access to these accounts before I finish the picture." She looked up. "Did you know?" "I suspected enough to let him go, not enough to document." "Then we document now." She held his gaze. "I'll need you to sit down and go through the March and April accounts with me. There are entries I can't verify without knowing what work was actually ordered." He sat. He sat across from her at his own desk in his own study and answered her questions and did not once suggest she was overstepping or moving too quickly. He answered plainly, and when he didn't know something, he said so, and when the numbers confirmed what she'd suspected, he said nothing at all, just looked at the ledger with the tight expression of a man absorbing something he would have preferred not to have confirmed. They were still working when the sound came from downstairs. Voices. The front door. Mrs. Holt's controlled but slightly raised tone, which Clara had already learned was the equivalent of a shout from any other person, and then cutting through all of it with the precision of a woman who had spent 30 years making herself impossible to ignore Augusta Whitcom's voice. "I am her mother," Augusta said from the entry hall below. "I will not be announced." Clara set down her pen. Nathaniel's eyes went to her face. She kept her expression exactly level, which cost her something, though she didn't show it. "She didn't waste time," she said. "No." He was already standing. "I'll go down." "Stay." Clara rose from the chair. "Let me." "Clara." "I've been managing Augusta Whitcomb for 6 years," she said. "I know every version of her. Sit down." He stayed. She went downstairs. Augusta was in the entry hall with both Caroline and Eliza behind her, and she had dressed for this. That was the first thing Clara registered. Augusta's best traveling clothes, her best jewelry, the hat she wore when she needed to remind people that the Whitcomb name still carried something in Charleston society. She had come here prepared, which meant she had planned this, which meant she had spent the night deciding exactly what she intended to accomplish. "Augusta?" Clara said from the bottom of the stairs. Not Mrs. Whitcomb. Not a question. Just the name flat and unornamented. Augusta's eyes tracked up to her. Something moved in them, assessment adjustment, and then the performance settled into place. Warm. Concerned. A mother who had traveled a long way to check on a daughter she loved. "Clara, darling," Augusta came forward. "I was worried. You left so quickly. You didn't even say a proper goodbye." "You were in the doorway," Clara said. "I walked past you. You were upset." Augusta reached out and touched Clara's arm, a performance of tenderness, so practiced it had its own kind of precision. "It's understandable. This is a very abrupt change. We thought we should come and make sure you've settled in properly. That you have everything you need." "I have everything I need," Clara said. "And Mr. Blackwood is treating you well. Mr. Blackwood and I are managing the estate accounts together. We were in the middle of something when you arrived." Eliza's eyes moved around the entry hall in a way that was trying to look casual and wasn't. "What a remarkable house," she said. "Bigger than I expected. Are all these rooms in use?" "Some are," Clara said. "Some aren't yet." "Yet," Caroline repeated with a smile that meant something other than warmth. "How industrious of you." Nathaniel appeared at the top of the stairs. He came down without hurrying, and his expression was the expression he wore when he had decided not to show what he was thinking, level watchful, giving nothing away. "Mrs. Whitcomb," he said. "Miss Whitcomb. Miss Eliza. Mr. Blackwood." Augusta turned the warmth on him like a lamp adjusted to a new room. "We hope you'll forgive the intrusion. We couldn't bear not seeing Clara settled." "Clara seems quite settled," he said. "Yes, she does." Augusta looked between them, and something behind her eyes recalculated. "We were hoping you might allow us to stay for supper. Just a small family visit. Surely you can accommodate us." Clara felt the particular weight of that, surely the way Augusta deployed that word like a hand laid on a scale. "Of course," Nathaniel said before Clara could answer. Clara looked at him. He looked back at her with an expression that said plainly, "I'm sorry, and I know, and it will be better if they stay where we can see them all at once." She turned back to Augusta. "Supper's at 7, she said. "Mrs. Holt will show you where you can rest until then." She went back upstairs. She closed the study door behind her, pressed her back against it for exactly 3 seconds, and then she went back to the ledgers, because there was still something she hadn't found yet. She could feel it, the specific absence of a particular piece, the gap in the record where something should have been and wasn't. Her father's shipping shares had been tied to an agreement that predated Augusta's management of the estate, but the correspondence she'd found so far in the study only went back to 1812, 2 years after Thomas Whitcomb died. The earlier files were somewhere else. She pulled open the bottom drawer of the cabinet. Empty. She pulled open the cabinet beside it. Empty. She stood in the middle of the study and thought about locked rooms and missing files and a housekeeper who had watched the accounts for years without the standing to say anything, and a man who had fired an estate manager without fully documenting why. She went back to the desk and looked at the key ring that Nathaniel had left out when he went downstairs. 12 keys. She knew what 11 of them opened. She had asked Mrs. Holt that morning. The 12th was smaller than the others, older, a different manufacturer entirely. She picked up the key ring. She went to the room at the end of the hall that Mrs. Holt had told her with careful neutrality was kept locked because it had been Mrs. Blackwood's sitting room and had not been opened since she died. The key fit. The room had been sealed for nearly 2 years, and the air inside was stale and close, and the furniture had been draped with cloth, but the cabinet against the far wall had not been draped. It stood open and used with files inside it that were clearly recent, clearly handled, clearly not left over from a dead woman's private correspondence. Clara crossed the room and pulled out the first folder. Her father's name was on the third page. She sat down on the floor with the folder in her lap and read. It took her the better part of 20 minutes to understand what she was holding, and when she understood it, she sat very still for a long moment and let the full weight of it settle. It wasn't just that the debt had been exaggerated. It wasn't just that Pollard had been skimming from the estate accounts. What she held in her hands was a record of the original transfer document for her father's shipping shares, the one Mrs. Bellamy had told her was altered. And beside it in the same folder was a second copy clearly drafted by a different hand with a signature at the bottom that was almost exactly like her father's, and not quite. And below that, a letter. The letter was dated 4 months after Thomas Whitcom's death, and it was addressed to a man named Harlan Kress, who had handled Augusta's legal affairs in the first year of the estate proceedings. It was not in her father's hand. It was not signed with her father's name, but it referenced a sum of money paid in exchange for the processing of a transfer document, and it referenced the estate by name, and it referenced a beneficiary who was not Clara. It was in Augusta's handwriting. Clara recognized it the way she recognized an old scar immediately and without pleasure. She put the papers back in order. She put the folder in her hands. She went downstairs. Nathaniel was in the library. He heard her on the stairs and looked up. He looked at her face, then at the folder in her hands, then back at her face. "What did you find?" he said. "Where did you get this folder?" She set it on the table in front of him and opened it to the letter. "This room, this cabinet, where did these papers come from?" He looked at the folder. His jaw tightened. "Pollard had them," he said quietly. "I found them when I went through his office in March. I didn't know what they were in connection with. I didn't—" He stopped. "I didn't know they were your father's." "You didn't read them." "I read enough to know they were irregular. I locked them away to deal with when I had more information." He looked up at her. "Clara, I didn't know." She believed him. She didn't know if that made it better or worse, the idea that this evidence had been sitting in a locked room in this house for months, waiting while she carried her stepsister's gloves across ballroom floors. "Augusta forged documents," she said, "after my father died. She transferred his shipping shares using a signature that isn't his. I have the original and the forgery side by side." She tapped the folder. "This is what Mrs. Bellamy was trying to tell me. This is why the shares never appeared in the estate proceedings, because Augusta removed them before proceedings began." Nathaniel was very still. "How much were the shares worth?" he said. "At 1810 values." Clara looked at him steadily. "Enough to fund 2 daughters' social seasons for 6 years. Enough for a new house on Meeting Street. Enough to pay a lawyer to look the other way." He sat back. She closed the folder. "I need you to tell me," she said, "that you will support what I do with this. Not manage it. Not decide for me how it's handled or what the outcome should be. I need to know that if I choose to act on these documents, you will not stand between me and that choice." He met her eyes. "I won't stand between you and anything," he said. "Not again." She held his gaze for one more beat, testing it, measuring the truth of it. Then she nodded. "Once. Tonight at supper," she said. "Let Augusta talk. Don't interrupt her. Don't correct her. Don't defend me." She picked up the folder. "I'll handle it." Supper at Blackwood Landing that evening was a performance from the moment Augusta sat down. She had refreshed herself and repaired her presentation, and arrived at the table with the confidence of a woman who had decided that this situation could still be managed if she handled it correctly. She began with the house, its qualities which were genuine, and its deficiencies which were mostly imagined. The dining room was elegant, but the silver wanted polishing. The food was acceptable, but the seasoning was uncertain. She said all of this in the tone of warm helpfulness, the tone that said, "I'm only trying to assist," and every observation landed like a small stone thrown at something she could not reach directly. Clara ate her supper. She said very little. Eliza found her footing in the middle of the soup course. "You must be finding it quite an adjustment," Eliza said, looking at Clara across the table with wide and counterfeit concern. "Managing a house of this size, it's such a different skill from A small pause, perfectly timed. "From what you've been accustomed to." "I'm finding it straightforward," Clara said. "Oh, I'm sure you're doing your best." Eliza smiled at Nathaniel. "She's always been very eager. Aren't you, Clara? Very eager to be useful." "Eliza," Caroline murmured. "I'm paying a compliment," Eliza said. "Usefulness is a virtue. Papa always said so." Nathaniel set down his fork. Clara put her hand on the table, not touching him, but near enough that he saw it, and gave the smallest shake of her head. He picked up his fork. "She managed my father's house beautifully." Eliza continued to the table in general. "Every seam, every hem, every glove and fan and boot. Very capable hands." "Eliza," Augusta said. "Though, of course," Eliza said, her voice brightening, "managing a river estate is quite another matter. It requires a certain—" She tilted her head. "Background. A woman who knows how to move in society, how to speak to business partners, how to represent a name that means something." The table went quiet. Clara set down her own fork. She looked at Eliza not with anger, not with hurt, but with the calm attention of a woman who has decided the moment has arrived. "Eliza," she said pleasantly, "when did your father die?" Eliza blinked. "What?" "Your father, my father, Thomas Whitcom. When did he die?" "You know when he died." "Humor me." Eliza's eyes flicked to Augusta. "June," she said. 1810. June of 1810. Clara agreed. "And in August of 1810, 2 months later, a transfer document moved his shipping shares out of the estate. Did you know that—" The table had gone entirely still. Augusta's hand moved toward her water glass and stopped. "I don't know what you're talking about," Eliza said. "You might not," Clara said. "Your mother would." She turned to Augusta. "Wouldn't you?" Augusta said, "This is not the time or place." "You're a guest in my home," Clara said quietly and completely. "I'll decide what the time and place is." "Your home." Augusta's voice took on the edge that lived beneath all the performances, the real thing, sharp and unadorned. "You've been married 36 hours. This is his house. You are a guest here the same as I am." "No," Clara said. "I'm not." She looked at Nathaniel. He didn't speak. He sat back in his chair and looked at his wife with an expression that was for the first time uncomplicated, clear and still, and entirely on her side. Clara reached to the chair beside her and lifted the folder she had placed there before supper. She opened it and set the 2 documents flat on the dining table side by side. "This," she said, pointing to the first page, "is the original transfer agreement for my father's shipping shares. This is his actual signature. I have 15 examples of his handwriting from his personal correspondence to compare it to." She pointed to the second document. "This is the document filed in the estate proceedings 2 months after his death. The signature is not his." No one at the table moved. "The letter below it," Clara continued, "is addressed to Harlan Kress, who handled the estate legal proceedings. It references a payment made in exchange for accepting the altered document. It is in your handwriting, Augusta." She looked at her stepmother. Not with triumph. With the specific tiredness of someone who has finally reached the end of a very long road. "I recognized your hand before I recognized anything else on the page." Augusta sat perfectly still. Caroline's face had gone white. Eliza looked between her mother and the documents and said very quietly, "Mama." "It's a fabrication," Augusta said. Her voice was controlled barely. "It's something you've produced too." "These documents were in this estate's possession before I arrived here," Clara said. "Mrs. Holt can confirm the cabinet they were found in. Mr. Blackwood can confirm when they were first collected." She folded her hands on the table. "You can call it a fabrication. You can take that position with Mrs. Bellamy's solicitor in Richmond, who has been building a parallel case from the original correspondence. Or you can sit quietly and let me finish." Augusta sat quietly. "Those shares," Clara said, "were worth close to $3,000 in 1810. Over 6 years, with the returns from the shipping company before it collapsed, the value drawn from that transfer is closer to 4,000. She paused, which is a number that should sound familiar to everyone at this table. The silence broke open. "The debt," Nathaniel said very carefully, "was approximately equal," Clara said, "to what was taken from my father's estate." She looked at him. "I don't think that's a coincidence. I think someone knew the original debt figure before you named it. I think someone made sure the two amounts balanced so that any claim I made could be answered with a counterclaim." Nathaniel stared at her. Then he turned and looked at Augusta with an expression that was no longer controlled. "You knew about the debt before I came to the house," he said. "Not to the room, to Augusta specifically." Augusta said nothing. "You've known about those shares for 6 years, Clara said. "You knew the moment I started asking questions, the moment I was anywhere near legal standing, someone would eventually follow the paper trail. You needed me married and managed, and at a distance from any lawyer who knew my father's name." She looked at Augusta steadily. "You almost managed it. Hargreaves. Mr. Blackwood told me about him." Something crossed Augusta's face that was not quite remorse and not quite fear, and landed somewhere between them. "You had no standing," Augusta said. "You had no money, no connections, no—" "I had my father's name," Clara said. "That was always enough. You just needed me not to know it." Caroline reached across the table and put her hand over Eliza's. It was the first genuine gesture Clara had ever seen pass between them, the reflex of two people who have just watched the ground move. Augusta looked at the documents on the table. She looked at her daughters. She looked at Clara with an expression that had shed every layer of performance and revealed what was underneath a tired woman who had spent 6 years managing a lie and had just watched someone younger and angrier set it out in the light where everyone could see it. She did not apologize. Clara had not expected her to. "You'll want to leave tonight," Clara said. "There's still enough daylight for the road back to Charleston. I'll have the wagon brought around." "You don't have the authority." "I do," Nathaniel said. Quiet. Final. "My wife asked you to leave. I'm confirming it." Augusta rose from the table. She did not speak again. She moved toward the door with the particular careful dignity of a woman who has lost and is choosing how she loses, and Caroline and Eliza rose and followed her, and the dining room was emptied of them in under 2 minutes. Clara sat at the table for a long moment after the sound of footsteps on the stairs faded. Nathaniel hadn't moved. "You knew," he said. "You knew before supper." "I knew since this afternoon. You let her sit down and eat a full meal before you said a word." "I wanted her comfortable," Clara said. "Comfortable people make mistakes, and I wanted witnesses." He was looking at her in a way that was hard to name, not quite admiration, not quite surprise. Something that lived in the space between a man who thought he knew what he had arranged and the moment he understood, he had arranged something entirely different. "Those documents," he said. "What are you going to do with them?" "I'm going to send copies to Mrs. Bellamy in Richmond tomorrow morning," Clara said. "And I'm going to write to Harlan Kress and inform him that I am aware of his involvement and that he has 2 weeks to voluntarily return any compensation received before I involve the courts." "And Augusta?" Clara looked at the documents on the table. She thought about 6 years of faded dresses and other people's gloves. She thought about her father's voice from somewhere she couldn't reach anymore. "Augusta has 2 daughters," she said. "Whatever she took, some part of it paid for their futures. I won't take that from them to make a point." She folded the documents back into the folder. "But she will answer for this. Quietly and legally and completely." She picked up the folder. She stood. She looked at Nathaniel Blackwood across the table, her husband of 36 hours, who had lied to bring her here and told the truth when she pressed him and sat back and let her speak when it mattered most. "Thank you," she said, "for not interrupting." "You didn't need me to," he said. "No," she agreed. "I didn't." She walked out of the dining room with the folder under her arm and her father's documents against her chest, and for the first time in 6 years, she walked like a woman who was going somewhere she had chosen herself. The wagon carrying Augusta and her daughters cleared the Blackwood landing gate before the sun fully set. Clara watched it from the upstairs hall window. Not with satisfaction, not with grief, but with the particular hollowness that follows a long-anticipated thing finally arriving and passing. 6 years of a woman's presence reduced to wheel tracks in the summer dust. She watched until the road was empty. Then she went back to work. The study lamp burned past midnight. She had the full set of household accounts open now, not just the current year, but the 4 years prior, and the inventory records, and the staff ledgers, and the receipts that Mrs. Holt had quietly accumulated in a personal file, because she hadn't trusted the official ones. Clara worked through them with the methodical patience of a woman who understood that the truth lived in the details, and that details did not reveal themselves to impatience. By the time the candle burned low, she had a complete picture. And the picture was worse than she'd expected. It wasn't just Pollard's billing fraud. It wasn't just the skimmed supply orders and the phantom roofing repairs. There were tenant accounts going back 3 years in which families along the river had been charged rent increases that were never authorized in the original lease agreements. There were wage records showing that 6 of the estate's long-term workers had been shorted their full pay for 18 months, small amounts per week, the kind of small that hoped not to be noticed, adding up over time to figures that should have embarrassed anyone who saw them. And at the bottom of the wage file, she found a name she recognized. Old James Cutter, 64 years old, had worked the Blackwood Landing River operation since before Nathaniel inherited the estate. His wage entry for the last year showed a rate 20% below what every other comparable worker received, with no notation, no explanation, no authorization she could find. She wrote his name at the top of her notes page. She closed the ledger. She went to bed. In the morning, she found Nathaniel at the breakfast table before she arrived, which was early enough that she understood he also hadn't slept well. He looked at her face and then at the notes in her hand. "How bad?" he said. "Bad enough." She sat down across from him and put the notes on the table between them. "I need you to explain James Cutter's wage reduction." Nathaniel looked at the notes. Something moved across his face, not guilt, but something adjacent to it. The expression of a man who has let something happen by not paying sufficient attention. Pollard managed the wage ledgers. Pollard managed a lot of things you didn't supervise. Yes. He didn't deflect it. That's accurate. James Cutter has worked this property for 22 years, Clara said. He was shorted for 12 months. I want it corrected and back paid by the end of the week. Nathaniel nodded. All of them, she said. Every worker with a discrepancy. I've marked them in the ledger. All right. And the tenant families on the south parcels. The Weaver family and the Grants, they were charged increases that aren't in their original lease agreements. I need those leases pulled and the overcharges refunded. Clara. He said her name quietly, and not to interrupt her, more like a man placing a stone to mark a moment. I'll do all of it. Whatever you've found, we fix it. He looked at her steadily. I should have been watching this more carefully. I wasn't. That's on me. She studied him for the moment, the set of his jaw, the directness of his gaze, the absence of the kind of defensive performance she had watched men produce her entire life when confronted with their own failures. You trusted the wrong person, she said. I trusted no one, which turned out to be the same thing. He reached across and turned her notes toward him. Tell me what else. She told him. All of it. Tenant by tenant, line by line, discrepancy by discrepancy, and he listened without interrupting and wrote his own notes in the margin and asked 3 clarifying questions that were exactly the right 3 questions, and by the time breakfast was finished, they had a plan and a sequence and a timeline. It was the first morning Clara Whitcomb had ever spent being listened to at a breakfast table. She registered that quietly. She didn't remark on it. After breakfast, she went to find James Cutter herself. He was at the river dock managing the morning delivery with the unhurried authority of a man who has done the same work long enough that his body knows it without consulting his mind. He was broad-shouldered and weather-worn, with hands that had forgotten what it felt like to not carry something. "Mr. Cutter," Clara said. He turned and looked at her with the particular wariness of a man who has learned that when the house comes to find you at the dock, it usually means more work or less pay. "Ma'am," he said, careful and neutral, "my name is Clara Blackwood. I've been reviewing the estate accounts." "I know who you are." A pause. "Word travels on a working property. I imagine it does." She looked at him directly. "I found your wage records for the past year. You were underpaid. I don't know if anyone told you that, or if you knew and said nothing, or if you trusted it would be corrected." James Cutter said nothing for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was level and deliberate, the voice of a man measuring every word before he spent it. "I noticed," he said. "I asked Pollard about it twice. He told me it was a temporary adjustment while the estate handled operating costs." "It wasn't a temporary adjustment. It was Pollard taking money that belonged to you." Clara held his gaze. "I'm sorry it happened. It won't continue. Mr. Blackwood is arranging the back pay today." James Cutter looked at her. He had the expression of a man who has been told good news before and learned to wait before believing it. "All of it," he said. "All of it," she said. 12 months. He looked down at the dock and back up. Something shifted in his face, not gratitude exactly, not yet. But the small unlocking of attention, held so long, it had started to feel like the natural state. "You went through the whole ledger yourself," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "I did. First person that's done that in 4 years." He looked at her for one more beat. "Then I reckon we'll see." "Yes," she said. "You will." She turned and walked back toward the house, and she was aware without looking back of James Cutter watching her go. Not with suspicion this time. With something closer to attention. 3 days later, Mrs. Bellamy's reply arrived from Richmond. Clara read it at the study desk with the door open and the morning moving around her, the sound of the house going about its business. Mrs. Holt directing the kitchen, the distant voices of workers in the far field. The letter was 2 pages in Mrs. Bellamy's careful hand. She had received Clara's copies. She had compared them to the materials her own solicitor had assembled. The case, she wrote, was now sufficient to bring before a Charleston magistrate. The forged transfer document, the letter to Harlan Cress, the parallel records of the share payments taken together, they constituted a clear and prosecutable fraud. She also wrote, "Harlan Cress sent a letter to my solicitor's office yesterday. He is prepared to cooperate." Clara set the letter down. She sat for a moment with her hands in her lap and let herself feel the full weight of it. Not triumph, because triumph implied a contest, and what she felt was closer to the specific relief of a thing that has been wrong for a long time, finally beginning to come right. She was still sitting there when Nathaniel came to the doorway. "Bellamy," he said, reading her face. "Cress is cooperating," she said. "It moves to the magistrate." He let out a slow breath. "That's it then." "Not quite." She looked at him. "There's one more thing." She turned to the secondary page of her notes, the one she hadn't yet shown him. "The shipping shares. When the transfer is reversed and the value is restored to my father's estate to my legal inheritance, the amount is significant." She named the figure. Nathaniel was quiet. "That," she said carefully, "changes the terms of our arrangement." "In what way?" "When you proposed this marriage, you proposed it against a debt." She held his gaze. "That debt was partly manufactured, and the money it was meant to represent was already owed to me in another form, which means the original terms of our agreement were built on a false foundation from both sides." He was listening with absolute attention. "I'm not asking to dissolve anything," she said before he could speak. "I'm asking to renegotiate. As equals, not as a debt and its creditor, not as a charity case and her benefactor." She put her hands flat on the desk. "I want a proper accounting. What I brought into this marriage, what you brought, what we each owe and are owed. And then I want us to decide what this is, what we actually want it to be, with all of that on the table." The silence held for several seconds. "That's a more honest conversation than most married people have," Nathaniel said. "Most married people don't start where we started." He came into the room and sat down across from her at the desk, where they had worked through accounts together, where she had confronted him with a forgery, and he had admitted his own deception, where they had built, over the past week, something that resembled a working partnership and was becoming carefully something more. "All right," he said. "What do you want?" Clara took a breath. "I want my name on the estate accounts, not as your wife in name only, as a legal co-manager. I want my signature to carry the same authority as yours on every contract with tenants, suppliers, and workers." "Done." "I want the locked room at the end of the hall unlocked permanently and converted to an office for my use." "Also done." "And I want—" She stopped. He waited. "I want to know," she said more quietly, "what you actually thought was going to happen. When you walked into that ballroom, when you chose me." She looked at him directly. "Not the debt, not the logistics. What you thought." Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment, long enough that she thought he might redirect or deflect, or produce one of the careful non-answers he was capable of when a question got too close to something unmanaged. Instead, he said, "I thought I was going to bring a woman out of a bad situation and give her a decent life, and ask for nothing more than the running of a house I couldn't run properly alone." He paused. "I thought I could do it cleanly, practically, without—" Another pause. "Without it becoming what it's becoming." "What is it becoming?" she said. He looked at her. "I don't know yet," he said, "but I'd like to find out." Clara looked at her hands on the desk. She thought about what she had expected from this marriage, and what she had found instead: a man who lied and admitted it, who sat across from her at a breakfast table and wrote notes in the margins of her work, who had stayed in his chair at supper and let her dismantle 6 years of Augusta's architecture without saying a single word. "So would I," she said. The back wages were paid by Friday. James Cutter came to find her that afternoon, not at the dock this time, not at his station, but at the house itself. He knocked at the side door, hat in hand, and when Mrs. Holt brought him to the study, he stood in the doorway with the particular straight-backed dignity of a man who does not bend easily, but bends when it is warranted. "Mrs. Blackwood," he said. "Mr. Cutter. I wanted to say—" He stopped, started again. "The men on the property, the families on the south parcels, they're talking." He looked at her steadily. "Saying things are different, that someone's actually looking at the books." "Someone is," she said. "Yes, ma'am." A pause. "We appreciate it." She looked at him. "I'm not doing it to be appreciated," she said. "I'm doing it because it's right, and it wasn't being done. Those are two different things." James Cutter almost smiled. It was the kind of almost smile that meant more than a full one. "Yes, ma'am," he said again. Still, he left. Clara listened to his footsteps down the hall and thought about all the things a property held: not just its acreage and its ledgers and its legal agreements, but the people who had worked it and waited and watched for someone to pay attention. She thought about what it meant to hold something in trust, what it cost when that trust was broken, what it required to earn it back. She pulled the next ledger toward her and kept working. The letter from Harlan Cress's solicitor arrived the following Tuesday. It was formal and brief, and its central message was unambiguous. Cress would provide a full account of the transaction, including the payment received and the documentation falsified, in exchange for prosecutorial consideration. He named Augusta Whitcom explicitly. He named 2 other parties involved in the estate proceedings whose names Clara did not recognize, but whose functions she could infer from context. She read the letter twice. Then she did something she had not done since she was 9 years old, and her father had lifted her above a crowd to see the chandeliers. She walked out of the study, down the hall, out the back of the house, and down to the river. She stood at the bank and breathed. The Cooper River in midsummer moved with slow authority, wide and brown and indifferent to human arrangements, carrying whatever was placed on it toward the harbor and the sea. Her father had run shipping lines on this river. He had stood somewhere along its bank, probably not far from this spot, and looked at the water and thought about his daughter and what he was building for her. He had not built it well enough. He had not structured it tightly enough. He had loved her without adequately protecting her, which was its own kind of failure, the failure of a man who believed the world would be as generous as he was. But the river was still here, and so was she. She heard footsteps on the bank behind her and didn't turn. She knew the sound of Nathaniel's walk by now, unhurried, deliberate, the walk of a man who has nowhere to be that is more important than where he is. He stood beside her, said nothing. She let the silence run for a moment. "Cress is cooperating," she said. "Fully." "I know. I saw the letter. Augusta will be named in the magistrate's proceedings." She paused. "Caroline and Eliza will know. The whole city will know." "Yes. I keep thinking." She stopped, looked at the river. "I keep thinking about what I want to happen to her. Whether I want her to suffer for it, whether I want to stand in a courtroom and watch it." She was quiet. "I thought I would. 6 years of that house, and I thought the thing I wanted most in the world was for her to answer for it." "And now," Nathaniel said, "now I want my father's name cleared," she said. "I want the record corrected. I want the families she defrauded to have access to a remedy." She breathed in slowly. "I don't particularly want to destroy her daughters. They didn't know the full of it. At least Caroline didn't. And Eliza was—" A pause. "Eliza was cruel to me. But she was also raised by a woman who taught her that cruelty was how you held your place in the world." She looked at the river. "That's its own kind of damage." Nathaniel was quiet. "You're more generous than I would be," he said. "I'm not being generous," she said. "I'm being precise. There's a difference." She turned to look at him. "I want justice, not ruin. Those are not the same target." He looked at her for a moment, one of those long, quiet looks that she had stopped finding disconcerting and begun finding something else she didn't have a clean word for yet. "When this is finished," he said, "with the magistrate, with Bellamy, with all of it, what do you want to do?" She turned back to the river. "I've been thinking about that." "Tell me." Mrs. Bellamy mentioned in her first letter a case she'd handled peripherally, a widow in Richmond who lost her husband's property to a male cousin because there was no one who understood the legal mechanism to help her contest it in time. Clara kept her eyes on the water. "It's not an unusual situation. Women lose property every day because the process is inaccessible, and no one explains it to them until it's too late. What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking," she said, "that my father's name needs to mean something. Not just cleared, something." She felt the shape of the idea which had been forming since she read Mrs. Bellamy's second letter and hadn't yet said aloud. A legal trust, in his name. Something that provides women, widows, daughters, women in the position I was in, with access to a solicitor and a process before the clock runs out on their legal options. Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment. "That costs money?" he said. "I'm aware. And time. And influence. And you'll need someone in Charleston who knows the magistrates and the legal structures and who—" He stopped. She looked at him. His expression had arrived at something, a decision, a reorientation. "You'll need someone who can open doors that don't open for a woman alone." "Yes," she said. "I will. I know 3 magistrates personally," he said, "and 2 solicitors who owe me professional favors." He held her gaze. "I'll make the introductions, whatever doors you need open." Clara looked at him. She thought about what it meant not to be rescued, not to be managed, but to have someone stand beside you and say, "I have what you need, and it's yours, and I'm not keeping score." "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me," he said. "Thank me when it exists." She almost smiled. It was, she thought, the beginning of something she didn't have a name for yet. Not love, not exactly, or not yet, but something that had the same raw material. Something built on honesty and renegotiation, and two people who had started in a lie and worked their way painstakingly and imperfectly toward something true. The river moved. The summer held its heat without apology. She stood on the bank of her father's river with her husband beside her and thought, "This is mine. Not given. Not inherited. Mine because I stayed and I worked, and I refused to leave without the truth." Behind them, back at the house, Mrs. Holt was directing the afternoon kitchen with her particular iron efficiency. James Cutter was moving supplies at the dock. The tenant families on the south parcels were going about their evening with one fewer weight on their accounts. And in Charleston, in a parlor on Meeting Street, Augusta Whitcom was reading a letter from Harlan Cress's solicitor that she had not been expecting. Clara didn't know that yet. She would learn it by morning when a second letter arrived, this one from Caroline in handwriting that was shakier than usual, asking if they could speak. Not demanding, not performing. Asking. Clara would sit with that letter for a long time before she answered it. She would think about what she owed people who had wronged her, and what she owed herself, and where the line between justice and punishment actually ran when you could finally see it clearly. But that was morning. For now, she stood at the river with the light going orange and long across the water, and she breathed, and for the first time in 6 years, she did not feel like a woman waiting for permission to exist in her own life. She felt like a woman who had claimed it, and she was not done yet. Caroline's letter arrived with the morning. Clara read it at the breakfast table, before Nathaniel came down, before Mrs. Holt had finished with the kitchen, in the particular quiet of an early summer hour, when the house belonged only to itself. The handwriting was careful in the way handwriting gets when someone is trying to appear steadier than they are. The letters slightly too even. The lines slightly too controlled. "I know I have no right to ask anything of you," Caroline had written. "But I want you to know that I did not know about the documents. I did not know what Mother had done with Father's papers. I am not asking you to believe that. I am only asking you to know that I have said it." She had signed it with her first name only. Not Miss Whitcomb, not your stepsister, just Caroline, which was in its own way the most honest thing Clara had ever received from her. Clara folded the letter and held it for a moment. Then she wrote back. 6 sentences. She did not forgive Caroline because forgiveness was a thing that required more time and more honesty than 6 sentences could carry. But she told her the truth, that she believed her, that she did not intend to build her father's legacy on the ruin of 2 women who had also been shaped by Augusta's methods, and that what happened next in the magistrate's proceedings would follow the evidence and nothing beyond it. She sealed the letter. She addressed it. She gave it to the Morning Post. Nathaniel found her in the study when he came down. He looked at the sealed letter on the corner of the desk and at her face. "Caroline," he said. "She wanted me to know she didn't know," Clara said. "I believe her." "What about Eliza?" Clara was quiet for a moment. Eliza knew more than Caroline. Not everything, but she suspected. She picked up the ledger she'd been reviewing before the letter arrived. "I'll deal with Eliza when Eliza decides to write. And if she doesn't, then I'll deal with that instead." She looked up. "What time is the meeting with Bellamy's solicitor?" 2 o'clock. He's coming from Charleston. Then I have until noon to finish these tenant accounts." She turned back to the ledger. "Close the door on your way out, please." He almost smiled. She heard it in the pause before his footsteps moved away down the hall. The meeting with Mrs. Bellamy's solicitor, a sharp-eyed man named Aldridge, who carried his papers with the precision of someone who understood that documents were the only currency that reliably held its value, took 3 hours and established 2 things with clarity. First, the case against Augusta Whitcom was sufficient for civil proceedings and potentially criminal referral, depending on the magistrate's interpretation of the fraud statutes. Second, the reversal of the share transfer would restore to Clara a legal inheritance that, including 6 years of compounding value, exceeded anything she had anticipated when she first heard Mrs. Bellamy's warning across a Charleston ballroom. She sat with that number for a moment after Aldridge named it. Then she said, What portion would be required to establish a functioning legal trust? One with a retained solicitor, a formal charter, and the ability to take on cases without charging the client up front. Aldridge looked at her over his papers. He looked at Nathaniel, who was seated to her left and had not spoken for the better part of an hour. He looked back at Clara. "That depends on the scope," he said carefully. "South Carolina, initially," she said. "Women contesting inheritance fraud, improper estate transfers, unlawful exclusion from property rights. Cases like mine." She held his gaze. "How much?" He named a figure. She counter-proposed. They negotiated for 20 minutes with the focused efficiency of two people who respected each other's time, and when they finished, the trust had a budget, a preliminary charter structure, and a name. The Thomas Whitcom Legal Trust for Women's Property Rights. Aldridge wrote it at the top of his notes. He looked at it for a moment. "Your father," he said. "You wanted his name on it." "He didn't protect what he built," Clara said. "I intend for his name to do what he couldn't." Aldridge nodded once with the quiet respect of a man who has seen grief turned into something useful and recognizes it when it happens. After he left, Nathaniel said nothing for a long moment. "Then, you negotiated that budget down 15%. He had room," she said. "He always starts high." "You've never hired a solicitor in your life." "No," she said. "But I've watched Augusta manage men for 6 years. The principles are similar. You let them perform competence, you listen past the performance to the actual number, and then you offer slightly below it so they feel they've held ground." She closed her notes. "It works on most people." Nathaniel looked at her with the expression she had come to recognize as the one he wore when she had done something that genuinely surprised him, which was she had noticed becoming less frequent. Not because she had become less surprising, but because he was learning to anticipate her, which was its own kind of intimacy. "The charity gathering in Charleston," he said. Bellamy mentioned it in her letter. "The end of the month." "The Hargrove Summer Charity Assembly," Clara said. "Yes. She thinks it would be the right occasion to announce the trust publicly." "So do I." "Augusta will be there." Clara looked at him steadily. "I know." "She's going to come at you," he said. "In public, in front of people whose opinions matter to the legal proceedings. She's going to try to discredit you before you can discredit her." "Yes," Clara said. "She is." "And you want to go anyway." "I've spent 6 years being kept out of rooms," she said. "I'm done staying out of them." The charity assembly was held on the last Friday of August at Hargrove Hall, which was the same building where Clara had stood in the servant corridor 6 weeks ago holding Eliza's gloves. She arrived with Nathaniel in his carriage, wearing a dress that was not new, but was hers, a deep green that she had brought from Meeting Street in the small bag she packed herself unworn, because there had never been an occasion for it in Augusta's house. She wore it now. Nathaniel handed her down from the carriage and offered his arm, and she took it, and they walked into the assembly together, and the room recalibrated in the way rooms do when something has shifted in the social order and everyone feels it before they can name it. People spoke to her. That was the first thing she noticed. Not the pointed silence of exclusion, but actual conversation. Women who had watched her stand in that corridor 6 weeks ago now turned toward her with the slightly overcompensating warmth of people who were adjusting their position and wanted it acknowledged. She accepted each greeting with the same measured courtesy and moved through the room with Nathaniel at her side and her father's trust documents in the small leather case she carried. Mrs. Bellamy found her within 10 minutes. "You look well," Mrs. Bellamy said, and meant it in the way that encompasses more than appearance. "I feel well," Clara said, and also meant more than the words. "Aldridge told me about the budget negotiation." Mrs. Bellamy's eyes were bright and dry and deeply satisfied. "He said you were formidable." "He said I was difficult." Same thing from Aldridge. She took Clara's arm briefly. "The timing tonight after the charitable presentations before the dancing. That's the moment. Everyone will be in the room and paying attention." "I know the moment," Clara said. She did know it. She had thought about it every day for a week, the specific shape of the room and the sequence of the evening, and exactly where she would stand and what she would say. She had not written a speech. She had learned watching Augusta that a prepared speech sounded like a prepared speech, and a prepared speech was a performance, and what she intended tonight was not performance. She was still thinking about it when she heard Augusta's voice. It came from her left across two conversations at a volume calibrated as Augusta always calibrated everything to carry just far enough. The girl was always an opportunist, Augusta was saying to a woman Clara recognized as Mrs. Harlan Cress. Of all the people in Charleston, Augusta had chosen to stand beside the wife of the man who was cooperating with the magistrate's proceedings, attaching herself to Blackwood's name before anyone could advise him properly. He's a generous man, not a discerning one. Clara did not turn immediately. She finished the sentence she was speaking to Mrs. Bellamy. She set her glass of lemonade on the tray of a passing server. She straightened slightly, which was the only preparation she allowed herself. Then she turned. Augusta saw her turn. She had been watching for it. That was clear from the way she had not even tried to lower her voice. She wanted Clara to hear. She wanted this. Clara walked toward her, not quickly, not slowly. The walk of a woman going somewhere she intended to arrive. The two conversations between them went quiet as she passed through. "Augusta," she said. Augusta turned to face her fully. She wore black again, always the widow's authority, and her expression was the composed and slightly mournful expression of a woman who considers herself wronged. "Clara, I didn't realize you were here." "You raised your voice across a crowded room," Clara said. "You knew I was here." A small, contained silence. Mrs. Harlan Cress took a quiet step back. "I was only speaking honestly," Augusta said. "People in this city know the truth of things, even when it isn't comfortable. You married a man for his money, and his name, and his protection, and you've used that access to pursue a vendetta against your own family. You forged my father's signature," Clara said. The words went out into the room like a stone dropped into still water, flat, factual, without performance. The silence spread. "That is a vicious lie. Harlan Cress has submitted a full account to the magistrate," Clara said, at the same volume in the same tone. "In writing. Under oath. He names you specifically. He names the payment. He names the date." She looked at Augusta without anger, without satisfaction, with the particular calm of a woman who has already won, and is simply completing the formality of saying so. "I'm not saying this to hurt you, Augusta. I'm saying it because you said something false about me in a room full of people, and I won't let false things stand uncorrected." Augusta's face had gone the color of old linen. "You are a dressed-up dependent," Augusta said, and her voice had lost its calibration. It came out raw and too loud and wrong. "You have nothing that isn't his. You are nothing that isn't borrowed." "Mrs. Whitcomb." The voice was Nathaniel's. He had moved through the room quietly, the way he did everything, and was standing 3 feet to Clara's right. His voice was not raised. It didn't need to be. It had the particular authority of a man who does not often speak in public, and therefore is heard completely when he does. Augusta stopped. "My wife," Nathaniel said with a deliberateness that placed each word like a deliberate step, "has founded a legal trust in her father's name. She has corrected 6 years of fraud against her inheritance. She has restructured the management of a property that was being robbed under my watch. She has done all of this in 6 weeks." He looked at Augusta with an expression that was not hostile, which was Clara thought more damaging than hostility. It was the expression of a man looking at something he simply does not find worth the energy of anger. "She has nothing borrowed, nothing of mine that wasn't given freely, and that she hasn't earned twice over." He paused. "I would suggest you be careful about what you say in this room tonight." He stepped back. He looked at Clara. He did not speak for her again. She understood that. She looked back at him for exactly 1 beat. 1 beat that contained more than either of them would have known how to say out loud. And then she turned to the room. The room was entirely, completely attention forward. "I'd like to say something," Clara said. "If I may." No one moved. No one spoke. The string quartet had stopped playing, which Clara had not orchestrated but appreciated. "6 weeks ago I stood in this hall in a borrowed dress holding someone else's gloves," she said. "Some of you saw that. Some of you looked away, which I understand looking away is easier, and easier has its place." She held the room not with volume, but with the steadiness that comes from having nothing left to prove to anyone in it. "Tonight I want to announce the establishment of the Thomas Whitcom Legal Trust for Women's Property Rights, which will provide legal counsel and advocacy at no upfront cost to women in South Carolina who are contesting improper inheritance fraud, unlawful estate transfers, and the exclusion of daughters and widows from property they are legally entitled to hold." She reached into the leather case and produced a single printed document, the trust charter signed that morning by Aldridge and 2 witnesses. "My father was a man who loved generously and protected imperfectly," she said. "He left me in a position where the people managing his estate could take what he intended for me, and I had no mechanism and no standing to stop them." She looked at the room, not at Augusta, not at Nathaniel, at the women, specifically the ones who had looked away 6 weeks ago, the ones who had watched from the edges of their husbands' conversations, the ones who knew what it was to be the person at the edge of the room holding something that belonged to someone else. "That won't be my story alone. There are women in this city right now who are standing where I stood. This trust exists so that they have somewhere to stand that isn't a corridor." She set the charter on the presentation table. "That's all I wanted to say," she said. The room was quiet for 1 full second. Then Mrs. Bellamy began to applaud. She did it the way she did everything, without looking around to see if anyone would join her, without performing it, just doing it, because it was what the moment required. Others followed. Not all of them. Enough. Augusta Whitcomb left the room 10 minutes later. She walked out without speaking to anyone, with the careful composure of a woman who understood that the time for scenes had passed, and that whatever dignity she had left required a clean exit. Caroline, who had arrived separately and had been standing near the far wall, watched her mother go. She looked at Clara once across the room. Clara looked back. Nothing was resolved in that look. Nothing was repaired. But something was acknowledged, the specific acknowledgement of 2 women who shared a complicated history and had arrived separately and with different costs at the same place of understanding that Augusta's methods had served neither of them. Eliza was not there. Clara had not expected her to be. Mrs. Bellamy appeared at her elbow within 30 seconds of Augusta's departure. "Aldridge has 3 cases already in mind," she said without preamble. "Women he's known about for years who had no one to take their claims seriously." "Tell him to write to me this week," Clara said. "I want to be part of every intake review. You can't run the trust and the estate accounts and—" "I can," Clara said. "I'll need help, but I can." Mrs. Bellamy looked at her for a long moment with the expression she had been wearing. Clara realized, since the first night at the assembly, the expression of a woman who had been waiting for something to happen and was watching it finally happen. "Your father would have been—" She stopped. Started again. "He would have been proud and ashamed in equal measure, which is the honest answer." "I know," Clara said. "That's why I used his name. He can spend the rest of it making it right." The drive back to Blackwood Landing took 3 hours. They rode in the carriage mostly in silence, the productive kind, the kind that 2 people inhabit when there is more to say than can be organized into words, and both of them know it. The summer night moved past the windows. The road from Charleston to the river was long and familiar now in a way it hadn't been 6 weeks ago. Nathaniel spoke first. "Augusta will engage a solicitor," he said. "She'll contest the magistrate's proceedings." "She will," Clara agreed. "It will take months." "Yes." "And you're prepared for that?" "I've been prepared for a long time," she said. "Waiting is something Augusta taught me, though, not intentionally." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What you did tonight, what you said." "I meant it." "I know you did." He turned to look at her in the dark of the carriage, and she could hear the thing in his voice that he had been getting closer to saying for weeks, The thing that lived beneath the practical partnership and the account reviews and the evenings in the study that ran past midnight. "I want to say something." "Say it." "I'm sorry," he said. "Properly. Not the version I gave you the first night, which was an admission. An actual apology." He held her gaze. "I manipulated the situation that brought you here. I did it for reasons I believed were good, and they were partially good, and I was also partially wrong, and you deserve to hear me say it without an explanation wrapped around it." Clara listened. "I'm sorry," he said again. She was quiet for a moment. The carriage moved. The road went on. "I know," she said finally. "I've known for a while." "That's not the same as hearing it." "No," she agreed. "It isn't." She looked at him. "I accept it. The apology. I want you to know that." He breathed out slowly. "Do you—" He stopped. Something crossed his face, the particular difficulty of a careful man asking a question he genuinely does not know the answer to. "Do you regret it, all of it, the way it started?" She looked at her hands in her lap. She thought about the morning in the magistrate's office, and the wagon ride, and the study at dawn with 3 ledgers open, and a truth she hadn't expected to find. She thought about James Cutter on the dock, and Mrs. Bellamy's gray eyes, and Aldridge's face when she negotiated him down 15%. She thought about standing in Hargrove Hall tonight with her father's name on a charter and a room full of people who could not look away. "I regret the lie that brought me here," she said. "I don't regret the truth I found after." He was quiet. "That's a more generous answer than I earned," he said. "It's an honest one," she said. "Which is what I give." The carriage reached Blackwood Landing as the last of the evening light was going out of the sky. The house waited for them the way houses wait, solid domestic, full of the particular hum of a place that is lived in by people who are making something of it. Clara climbed down before Nathaniel could offer his hand. Not because she didn't want it, because she had learned in 6 weeks to know the difference between help offered in partnership and help offered as management, and she was still learning to receive the first kind without reflexively refusing the second. She took his hand. He looked at her when she did. She looked back. They walked into the house together. Mrs. Holt had left the entry lamp burning, and the study at the end of the hall was dark. The study with its ledgers and its correspondence and its open cabinet and its window that caught the river air in the early morning before the heat arrived. Clara had spent more hours in that room in 6 weeks than she had spent in any room in 6 years, and it had become quietly, incrementally, the way true things become hers. She walked to it. She opened the door. She lit the lamp on the desk, and the room came up around her. The familiar geometry of it, the smell of paper and river and lamp oil. The specific comfort of a place where she had sat with her hands on a ledger, and her father's name in her notes, and the conviction that the truth was findable if she was willing to look long enough. Nathaniel appeared in the doorway. "It's past midnight," he said. "I know. You've been going since before the sun this morning." "I have one more thing to write before I sleep," she said. "The intake criteria for the trust applications. I want it drafted before I meet with Aldridge." He looked at her for a moment. The lamp threw warm light across the desk and the open ledger and her hands already reaching for the pen. "I'll have Mrs. Holt bring coffee," he said. "Thank you." He didn't leave immediately. He stood in the doorway for a moment longer, and she felt him there, the way she had felt him across the ballroom 6 weeks ago, with a specific, grounded awareness that was neither alarm nor performance. Just the simple fact of a person's presence being registered by another person's body as something it has decided to trust. "Clara," he said. She looked up. "I'm glad you said yes," he said, that morning, in front of Augusta and both her girls. He held her gaze. "I'm glad you said yes." She looked at him. She thought about the glove spinning once in the ballroom air, about the only honest woman in the room, about a document on a side table, and a wagon ride down a river road, and a locked study, and all the mornings since, and what they had built in the space between a lie that started something and the truth that made it worth keeping. "So am I," she said. He nodded once. He went to find Mrs. Holt and the coffee. Clara turned back to the desk. She dipped the pen. She wrote the first line of the trust intake criteria in her own hand, in the study she had opened herself in the house she had earned in the name of a man who had loved her imperfectly, and whose name she was now going to make mean something permanent. She was not the girl in the servant corridor anymore. She was not the woman in the faded blue dress holding someone else's gloves. She was Clara Whitcomb, Blackwood daughter-wife founder, and the last person in Charleston anyone would ever again mistake for invisible. She had the keys. She held them herself. And she would not be putting them down.